Welcome to the Conversations with Christians Engaged podcast. I'm your host, Bunni Pounds, the president of Christians Engaged. This ministry exists to awaken, motivate, educate, and empower ordinary believers in Jesus Christ to do three things: to pray for our elected officials and our nation regularly, to vote in every election to impact our culture, and to engage in some form of civic education or involvement for the well-being of our nation.
I'm so thankful, Bunni, for what you do. A lot of people talk the talk, but you really walk the walk.
I love it, love it. Love teaming up with you, Bunni. So excited about what you're doing and the people you're reaching. And
I will stand and lock arms with this woman of God, Bunni Pounds, any day of the week.
Bunni, you are a new hero of mine.
America is worth it. Now is the time. America needs your involvement. Please take our pledge to pray, vote, and engage. Join with a movement of other Christians that are doing these three simple things that can really impact this nation. Join us. Hey everybody, it's Bunni Pounds. Hey guys, we are together here in the Dallas studio as we host you guys from around the country with our second annual virtual fundraiser for Christians Engaged. Last year we had Scott Turner and Chad Hennings. We talked about everything NFL. And, you know, what God provided in such a miraculous way. And this year, we are asking you to help us with this GOTV system, our voter mobilization system for all 50 states. And so many of you guys have been on the front lines with us, helping us grow this organization. And I am so thankful. We're going to hang out for a good long time. We're going to let you guys ask questions. But tonight, I have Governor Scott Walker from the great state of Wisconsin. Governor Walker, how are you?
I'm well, although I considered, you said second annual, it's Scott theme.
Yeah.
And apparently you're picking up great Scots along the way.
That's true. Great Scots. Let me give Governor Walker a real introduction. For those of y'all who don't know his life of public service, he grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. He's a pastor's kid, a minister's kid. His mom was a part-time bookkeeper and secretary, and he was very active in everything: sports, school, scouts, everything growing up in rural Wisconsin. And then in 1993, Scott was elected to the state assembly, where he helped lead the way for welfare reform, public safety, and educational opportunities. And in 2002, he was elected to county government, the Milwaukee County Executive Office. And he went on to reform government just every step of the way. Won re-election there, and then ran for governor. I want to hear that story a little more, how you go from a county official to a governor. He was elected 45th governor of Wisconsin. And this is the crazy part about Governor Walker's really history, is he inherited a $3.6 billion budget deficit, $800 million worth of unpaid bills. Can you imagine? That is crazy. And an 8% unemployment rate. And he had to instantly go to work reforming Wisconsin and making sure that the people remained free. He was the only governor in American history to survive a recall election in June 5, 2012. And was reelected completely in 2014. What I love about Governor Walker's story is he's a bold Christian that stood up. When times became tough, he got tougher. And he became America's governor. We loved him, ran for president in 2016. And I just am honored to know you, sir.
Thank you. Great to be with you. And thanks for what you're doing.
Well, we're going to get into that, but we met in Washington, D.C. at the March for Life. We were hanging out with Vice President Mike Pence's table there a year and a half ago.
At the Rose Dinner, yeah.
Yeah, it was great to meet you and your wife, Tanette, and you have two adult sons, too. How old are they?
Matthew's 28, soon to be 29 in the next month, and our other son's a year, a month, and a day younger. So They both live in the Wisconsin area, not too far from us. So we're pleased. One's about to get married.
Wow. Well, yeah. I have a 27 and 25-year-old sons, both married. First grandson is 7 months old, and we've got another one on the way from
awesome.
the older son. So we're super excited. I think all we do is produce boys in our family.
That's a good thing.
Probably y'all too. But what I loved about your record, sir, was just the boldness and courage that you carried. And really that came from faith in God, right? And the word of God. Can you talk a little bit about your faith journey and how it kind of got started?
Yeah, as we've talked about, both being PKs, having a preacher's family, it's by osmosis, people think you're just automatically a Christian. And I was raised in a godly family for sure. Both my parents, not only my father is a preacher, but my mother, who to this day still lives her faith more than anyone I know, just in everyday actions and her calls, her texts, her notes. She was funny to me. She told me for Mother's Day, she sent out about 50 special cards that she had made up, that she had made copies on a copy machine we got her to send to widows who had been recently widowed and who were elderly and were by themselves. I said, Mother, you are a widow who's elderly living by yourself, and here you are sending it to all these other women. It just, you can see the powerful, like probably a lot of the people listening have powerful witness. In fact, on Mother's Day, it was fun. Not only our church said, not only do you recognize your mothers, but who've been your church mothers, who've been the women in the church who've been great influences on you, and just how powerful that was. But so for me, I had this great influence, but it wasn't until the spring of 1980, so 43 years ago, that I went from knowing Jesus as someone my parents knew, like a lot of their adult friends. I knew them, but they were my parents' friends, to really realizing, it was kind of, my eyes were cleared, and I said, no, this is my friend. I know Jesus.
Yes.
And I know the impact he has in my life. And thankfully, that's been the case, not just in the challenging times as governor and even the years before as county executive, but even back 30 years ago when I was married to my wife. The year before the first date we had, I knew I was going to marry her. I knew that God wanted me to marry her. She had been a widow. Her brother, her only sibling, had died within the same year. I got to know just about everything about her in that one night, that one date with dinner that went from dinner to custard to listening to some jazz to coming back. And I just said, okay, God, you've clearly told me what you want me to do. And so I just think in life in general, we've tried to, more than anything we've done, tried to pass on to both of our sons that same sense of not only showing God in our life, but showing what a difference Jesus made in our lives and will for them. And thank God, literally, they've both accepted Christ as well.
I love that. My husband, we were best friends, and we never went on a date. And he took me out in his pest control truck to the state fair of Texas.
Being highly romantic in the pest control truck,
Exactly. And I think he was trying to keep me from going to Latin America. I was on my way with Youth with a Mission to be a missionary. And so there was like electricity going through the air at the state fair of Texas. And we got back to the International House of Pancakes, and he just said, I don't want to hold your hand. I don't want to kiss you. I just want to marry you.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's 27 years later, right? I mean, God puts you with who you need to be with. And I'm so thankful for him and our kids and, loving Jesus. It's great.
Well, and I don't want to touch on other things, but just one more quick thing on that, particularly those young people listening. One of the things I keep stressing to our kids that I think is missing so much in society is that if God is the center of your marriage, then as you and I know, there may be somebody out there listening who said all X number of years have been perfect, have been honeymoon, they've been wonderful. But for the rest of us who live in the real world,
gone through it, right?
But it's when God is the center of your life together, then you can make it. And unfortunately, there's far too many young people in the world today who say, well, I'm a little miffed about this, or, they don't do this right or that right, or no, God will help you get through it, but you got to be open to what God's will is and be willing to work with your partner in that regard. And that's why people like us have been blessed to be married for decades now.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, we're choosing to love, right? We're choosing to walk in covenant, and that's the most important thing. Well, we just got back from an in-person event in Dallas, and so we've gone through a lot of these questions, and I love that we're going to get to be a lot more relaxed because we only had 20 minutes, and now we can kind of dive into things a little bit more. But Governor Walker, what I loved about your story is just these moments where you had to choose to be courageous. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you chose to be bold? What empowered you in those moments? Because you talk about all the protesters, and you went up against the labor unions to reform things in Wisconsin. It was a brutal battle.
Yeah,
Everybody was following you on the news.
Yeah. The first couple of days, there were a few local reporters, then there were state reporters, then there were national reporters on cable, then there were network reporters, and pretty soon there was eventually 100,000 protesters occupied our Capitol and Capitol Square. We had death threats against me, against my family, against our administration, against our lawmakers. Just vivid ones. I remember one that said they were going to gut my wife like a deer. There's another one that said to my wife that there'd never been a governor in Wisconsin had been assassinated, but if she didn't do something, I might be the first. They talked about where my kids went into school. They talked about where my father-in-law lived. They talked about my parents. It was just unbelievable. But I think one of the most reassuring things throughout that process was, again, trying to stay focused. I've, since that spring of 80, tried to start and end my day the same way, on my knees, asking for God's guidance and thanking him at the end of the day, and to give rest, not only physical rest, but spiritual rest to start the day anew again the next day. And but God, no matter what you do in your life, not just in my case, but for anyone listening, maybe you're here but you have some doubts, God can do the same thing no matter where you're at in life. I remember when we had the protests started taking over our Capitol, we decided to get out of the Capitol and fly around the state and talk directly to the people. And then we'd show up at the airports and there'd be protesters out there, and we'd come inside. And I remember one of the first stops I was at a factory. And I love going to factories, still do. You see people working. You go to the workplace, they're respectful in the Midwest, but they're going to tell it like it is.
Oh, yeah, they're brutally honest.
Yeah. And so I'm going by this one piece of machinery. I think it was a CNC machine, and this guy is gigantic. He's like 6'6", 6'7", and he comes over to me, and he's got grease all over his stuff from his equipment, and I'm thinking, okay, here it comes. He puts his finger in my chest, and I'm like, you're gonna tell me he hates me. And he goes, Governor, I just want you to know, me and my family get on our knees and pray for you every single night.
Wow.
It's like, and we had that over and over again. I had a guy in Waukesha, Wisconsin, one of the crew that kept up the airport there, and he ran out and he gave me a piece of paper just as we were getting on the plane from one of these stops, or about to go up the steps, and it said Isaiah 54:17, and he just said that. So I pulled up. I didn't remember off the top of my head, so I pull up my Apple phone and pull up the app, my Bible app on there, and it's no weapon cast against you shall prevail.
Yes.
And it wasn't coincidence. It was God sending messages. Mm-hmm. Now, as Lincoln once said, when he was asked if God was on his side in this noble battle in the Civil War, he said, it's not for me to have God choose to be on my side, but rather for me to be on his. And it was just a sign, not necessarily that God checked off on every one of my agenda items. Rather, God was telling me, I'm there with you. I'm walking with you.
Yes.
I'm sending you messages.
Yes, that's so good. I ran for Congress in 2018, and it was a brutal Republican runoff. And at the end of that, I don't think anybody has, until you've lived through $1 million spent against you, you have a hard time relating. But just the recovery, it took me a couple years, sir, to actually recover, right, to get kind of over that. But I knew that God had pulled me out from behind the scenes as the political consultants for a reason, that for some reason he had made me become the person that spoke and the person that had the message, and could he use my story and my life for his glory. And I think that's how he works in all of our lives, if we're just obedient to the call of God on his life. And that's what we're trying to do with Christians around the country is to get Christians to understand the power of prayer, voting, and engagement, and that they simply, through simple obedience, can make a difference. Liberty is threatened in a lot of ways right now. We've got a lot of issues where we as Christians are being threatened, our religious liberties. You're the president right now of Young America's Foundation, so you are in touch with what's happening with the young people on campus. It's amazing what's happening. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening with young people and really what's happening in our country as far as the threats to liberty.
Well, and in many ways, we've seen this even before I was the head of Young Americans for Freedom. But the idea out there is that I think oftentimes on college campuses, it's the preview. Before you go to the movies, you see the preview. What happens on college campuses in the past, and even more so today, is tragically, much of what we see, a preview of the future. And we see it actually at cross sections. So we talk about Christians engaged, the work you're doing. I happen to be a conservative. It's a lot of work that we do at Young Americans for Freedom, YF out there. But oftentimes the most endangered species on a college campus is not just a conservative or a Christian. It's a Christian conservative because everyone's out to get you. For all the talk about diversity and tolerance, there is none. Increasingly in society, but explicitly on college campuses. And so what we see time and time again, you say, what's at threat? Everything we think about our founders, our founding principles, the idea that particularly spelled out in the First Amendment, that we have the right of freedom of speech, we have freedom to express ourselves in religion, we have freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. All those things are being restricted. You go to a college campus, if you are even remotely right of center, they're going to clamp down on you. They're either going to ban you outright or they're going to put such restrictions on, it's almost impossible. We frequently go to court to get even just modestly conservative speakers on campus, and it is mind-boggling because you think about it, the Constitution guarantees it, but it should be revered on our college campuses.
Yes.
That's the whole concept of college. You go to be challenged and think about different ideas and learn and expand.
Critical thinking.
Right. They don't want any of that. They want lockstep, almost mindless 1984 era type viewpoints there. And if you dare to speak out, like I say, not just as a conservative, but as a Christian, boy, you go after other groups, they'll be all over you. But you go after a Christian and or a conservative, and you're lifted up, you're praised, and it's remarkable. And so that's one of the biggest challenges out there. We see it time and time and time again. The data shows people ask on elections why we didn't have a red wave last year. It's because 18 to 29-year-olds overwhelmingly in Pennsylvania and Michigan, my state of Wisconsin, Arizona, other key battleground states, particularly for the U.S. Senate, they went for the radical candidate, and that was driven by those 18 to 29-year-old voters. The only thing I can say optimistic about it is it's not explicitly their fault because they've only been told one point of view, and I blame the rest of us in society for not doing a better job of exposing them to the full spectrum of what the truth is.
Well, y'all know, I spend a lot of time talking to pastors.
Yeah.
And one of my talking points to these pastors is we are making church irrelevant, by not actually talking about what's happening in our world. And so if we're not giving them what the Bible says and how for them to be able to articulate that and understand it to their core, we're not really giving them what they need to be able to combat stuff. And we can have our conservative talking points all day long, but the Word of God stands forever, right? And that should be the foundation where we're all going.
Well, a good example of that, Bunny. So I think there are some pastors, particularly at non-denominational, larger evangelical churches, that's the one I go to, fits that mode. But at many out there who feel like I don't want to offend parts of the congregation by talking about controversial issues.
Well, and I completely understand that, and we don't want to, yes.
Right, and I get that, but I think that, as we've said before, I get that we can't be of the world, but we still have to be in the world.
Yes.
And so I think an important thing about this, I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. So some of what we've seen in the past where some might call it fire and brimstone, where if you don't have this lockstep viewpoint on all these issues that are social issues tied into politics, we're gonna, you're not welcome. I get that. But by the flip side, particularly for young people in general in society, if you're a young person, you're going off to college and you can't get some support from your pastor in your church about how to stand up to defend life, you can't get some help to say, I'm not going to buy into I'm not going to put my pronouns up on, when I have to go in front of the professor. When you can't get some support about saying, I don't think it's fair that if I'm going to go to college to swim on the women's swim team, that I don't think it's right that someone is born as I don't think it's fair that someone is born as a biological male can compete against me and other women out there. If we can't get that kind of support from the church, where else are they going to get it from?
Yeah.
And so we can do it in ways that are loving, that aren't saying we hate people who disagree with us on this, but let's have a dialogue about it. Let's talk about what does the Bible tell us about these issues.
Well, and at the end of the day, Governor, these are not political issues. I mean, if look at Psalms 139. I mean, how do you read Psalms 139 and not see that God knew us from our mother's womb?
Right.
He knit us. We were fearfully and wonderfully made. You can't read Jeremiah 1:5
yeah.
and know that Jeremiah was ordained as a prophet to the nations before he was ever born, right?
How did Elizabeth have John the Baptist jump in her belly,
Acknowledging the Savior.
Exactly.
In the other womb.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that doesn't happen unless there's a human being there.
Exactly. So these are not political issues. These are biblical issues that we have to be informing people. And I know so many of our listeners listening to us right now, they're concerned because they've seen that people haven't got the healing and they haven't got what they need because truth is not being spoken in a lot of places. And they realize we need to be the ones, the leaders. You guys are the leaders, that you are the ones. That's why you're even connecting with this ministry and letting us feed you to be active in this space. And so anyway, thank you for being one of those. And I love that your story should be inspiring all these young people that you're now speaking to all the time as the president of Young America's Foundation to lead them into boldness and courage.
Well, and so I feel a kinship. I mean, they may not have 100,000 protesters in their classroom, but they feel like it.
Yeah.
That's part of the challenge. They feel not only from their professor, but increasingly from their fellow students, from the people on social media, from culture. The left really has perfected this. And the good news is, if you're a student listening or if you're a parent or grandparent, you feel overwhelmed about this. The good news is, I think, is that most young people aren't radicals. It's 15, 20%, particularly on our college campuses, who are just the boldest, most outspoken, the most over the top. But what they do is their goal is to intimidate students, to intimidate professors, to intimidate administrators. And you see it even in culture, to intimidate Bud Light, to intimidate Target, all these other places out there. And we, as common sense Christians, need to push back and say, no, we cannot be intimidated. We have to speak the truth, but we can do it with love. We can tell people, hey, I can love you and disagree with you. I can be passionate about wanting you to do well and wanting to show you the love of Christ and not just talk about it, but live it. But still, as Christ showed us, I mean, Christ opened his arms to everybody, but he didn't back away from the law of God either. I mean, he spoke the truth.
Right. Let's talk about these crazy imperfect candidates that we got to choose between. Here at Christians Engage, we're trying to help Christians that are being awakened in this hour pray, vote, and engage regularly. I'll go into a little bit more detail, guys, of how we're doing that. For those of y'all that aren't regular donors with us or partners with us. But, Governor, Jesus isn't on the ballot, right?
Right.
And we don't vote based on who we want to have a Diet Coke with. We vote on biblical principles. We vote on values. And a lot of people don't understand that the parties write these platforms, right, based on what the grassroots of the parties believe and the people. I got started as a homeschooling mom that went to a state convention and testified in front of a platform, never knowing that 20 years later, David Barton was nominating me to be his counterpart on national platform. But one thing leads to another. And so we have to vote for people in primaries. We've got a primary coming up. So let's talk about the primary first. Then we'll talk about voting in the general. But how do you make those choices in primaries, where you're going to vote, which parties, but also then picking between slightly different candidates? What are you looking for in leaders?
Well, I think a number of key things. We've talked a lot. It's a phrase out there, but I think it's accurate. You want people who share your values. When I say values, it goes beyond just issues. Specific issues are important, but you really want, at the fundamental level, what are the values you share? Where do you put your faith? To me, one of the most revealing things the last couple of years during COVID was seeing what people valued. There were some people at the federal, state, and even at the local levels, it's not even just necessarily partisan,
Oh, yeah.
who you could see valued the government controlling things.
Oh, yeah.
And we saw it to extremes. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan was probably the poster child for going off the deep end, where she, had the state order that Walmart could have the grocery section open, but not the area that sold the seeds if you wanted to grow your own garden. How is, like, COVID's not in one aisle, but in the other? It was just, obsessive fascination with government control out there. I think on the other side, you saw people who said, hey, yeah, this is serious, but I put my faith in the individual. I put my faith in the family. I ultimately put my faith in God. And I think I can have a reasonable conversation with people about what we should be doing, but I don't need the government to dictate all those terms out there. So I think it's really important to say, what are your values? It's part of the reason why I'm pro-life, not just because it's an issue, but because to me, that's a fundamental value.
Yes.
Am I ready to stand up for life? Which, by the way, since the Dobbs decision, I've said we shifted from the court of law to the court of public opinion. All the more reason why we need our churches to help us lead that charge in the court of public opinion. So it's finding candidates who share your values, and then who, again, they don't, particularly in the general, but even in the primary, it may not. I remember Churchill said this. I've heard Ted Cruz say this here in Texas, but I think it goes all the way to Churchill. He said, I'm going to vote for the most conservative candidate that can win. And so it's also important to realize that it's picking people who share your values, but you got to look at, where they're running, what can they win? Can they, because sometimes, and I get people say, oh, that's compromising. No, it's not compromising. But if there's 5 candidates and only 2 of them can win and one of them is really bad, I'm going to find the one that can win against the one who's shouldn't be in office out there. So it's a careful balance and all that. The other part, though, for the general election, when you said, Christ is not on the ballot, I think it's really important to remember, because I've said this before, but I had people challenge me. I ran for president, so I was my own first choice. I wasn't one of the other candidates. But eventually, Donald Trump was the nominee in 2016. And I looked where Hillary Clinton is at. I particularly looked at the kind of people that Donald Trump said he was going to surround himself with. People like Mike Pence he put on the ballot, some of the others he was talking about putting in. And I looked at the judicial picks that were up and the names that he put out there, and to his credit, he put them on the ballot.
Yep.
And I looked at Hillary Clinton and said there'd be 1, maybe 2 or 3. Little did we know it was all 3. And said we would be in such trouble. Our liberties, not just issues, would be at such risk. And I got some pushback from some friends of mine who are believers but aren't active, who said, how can you, an evangelical Christian, vote for Donald Trump? And I said, I said, did you read the Bible? I mean, people read the Bible and don't just watch the 10 Commandments on old movie clips. Know that Moses, wasn't Charlton Heston. Moses needed somebody else to talk for him. He was just the agent. You think about, Jonah didn't listen very well. You look at all these people, not the least of which is David, who was like the focal point.
He needed Jesus.
Right.
He needed God.
He needed God because this is a guy who sent, a guy to die in battle so that he could take his wife. I mean, how awful is that? And yet all these failed people were called by God to do his will. And that's what part of the key is. That's why first thing you say on your list, pray. I think a lot of times part of it's not only looking at the values, but pray. Say, God, who are you telling me to get behind? Not just do the vote for, but a lot of times to literally get behind and support along the way, because God always knows better in politics and life in general.
So good. Well, we're going to give you guys an opportunity to ask Governor Walker some questions. So there's a Q&A on the webinar, so you can go in and start filling in some questions. I know you guys have some questions, so go ahead and do that. I'm going to ask him a couple more questions, so we're not done. But I do want to share a little bit about Christians Engaged before we get too much further. For those of y'all who are just now starting to connect with us, we're 3.5 years old. We've been pioneering this national Christian ministry. And I'm telling you, God's been so gracious. But, I was thinking back the other day, I kind of say when I talk to people, if God can use a woman with a political resume for his glory, he can use anybody. But really, God called me. I felt like He helped me run a race for Congress, kind of blew up my consulting firm in that process for a reason. I really believe that He gave me a heart for the church. I've served 16 years as a political consultant, ran congressional campaigns, worked for Sean Duffy, governor, from the great state of Wisconsin, helping him here in Texas. And so I spent a lot of time with members of Congress. I know the systems. I know how it works. Worked for state legislators, worked for county officials. So had a lot of experience in my past that helps me figure out how can we get Christians involved and what do we need to build to enable them to do that. Secondly, my husband and I served church planting. We pastored house churches for years. I led worship. I've written songs, Bible studies. So I have a hunger for the Word of God. I love the Word of God. I'm a Christ for the Nations graduate and have a degree from Dallas Baptist University as well. So I think I'm uniquely qualified to lead this weird group of government professionals that want to help serve the church, really, across denominational lines. Why is Christians Engaged so important? Because the church is truly the answer. We believe the body of Christ has the answer to fill every kind of ill in our nation right now. If it's homelessness, foster care kids, saving the preborn, fiscal issues, everything can come down to the church being involved. And when I say the church, I'm talking about Protestants, Catholics, all of us that claim the name of Christ together in one city. But the statistics of Christians that call themselves born-again Christians in this nation, as I harp on all the time, are not any different than the church. We are not voting in presidential elections like we need. We're not voting in midterms. We're not voting in local elections and primaries. You're not even receiving the advertisement and the marketing from the candidates if you don't vote in a primary. You're not even going to get half the message. So I want to encourage people, and as we encourage people in churches all over, it's time to pray, vote, and engage regularly. That's our message. Pray. It's time to talk to God. Pray for our elected officials, our city, state, nation. It's time for us to vote in every election and engage our heart in some form of education or involvement for the well-being of America. We have two major products. When we stepped into this space, I did a lot of research to see what people were doing around the country. And there were two gaping holes in the body of Christ. One of them was there was not a real voter mobilization system that could remind Christians around the nation to vote in every election. We forget, right? We forget what's happening. We're all busy lives. So we built a 50-state solution to this in a church software program. Workflows to teach people how to vote in every election. You get a text and an email when early voting begins, when early voting's ending, 3 days before the election, and on election day. Special elections, we're able to cover that. State and federal elections, we're able to cover that. Secondly, we can't drive Christians to the polls to vote biblical values if they don't know what biblical values are. So we have to educate the church. And, we want to come alongside the local church and help Christians be activated and know what the Bible says about the issues. As Governor Walker and I were just talking about, there's a lot of misconception. There's a lot of people not being discipled in this space. So what does the Bible say about the sanctity of life? We just did a podcast series on the transgenderism issue. We just did a podcast series on life in a post-Roe world. So we're giving a lot of free resources through our weekly show, hundreds of articles you can find on our website, and then really concise 6 to 8 hour on-demand video curriculum series where you can go through biblical justice, biblical economics, how to be involved in civics, how to be involved in all these spaces, local government, our Nehemiah leadership class. So we are building between now and the end of 2024, we're going to have 8 major curriculum projects. So people can get these, and you guys know because a lot of y'all have been through these, $29 for any family to have these forever, homeschooling families. Anybody in the country can go through these, and we're also taking them to churches if they want to book us on a Saturday. So, we have a lot of things that God's given us, but I want to give you the numbers because I'm a former political consultant. That's what we do. 100,000 people now in 3.5 years have been added into our communication system. This is through being in 125 churches, having ground games in Texas, Pennsylvania. We now have area leaders in Arizona, Florida. We're building other places on the ground. But we're also building that through strategic ministry partnerships now with these churches. Robert Morris at Gateway Church a few weeks ago highlighted to people that they need to vote in their local elections. And he said, text the word vote, and we're going to get you resources to vote in these elections. That was us, Christians Engaged. Prestonwood Baptist, so many different places. James Robison, Intercessors for America. We're now able to partner and strategically partner with national ministries and local churches all over the country. But this is the numbers. 91.7% of our Texas people that took the pledge to pray, vote, and engage voted in the midterms. We connected them with voter data, and the ones that we could put together, 91.7% voted. 72% of them voted in the primary. I mean, just again, 4 texts and 4 emails. This is not rocket science. But and a lot of those, 21% of them had never voted in a primary before. Yay. 2% of them voted in the Democratic primary. And why do I even say that number? Because Bible-believing churches push people to Bible-believing principles. 1,630 people have gone through our curriculum courses now. And over 1.1 million people have been touched by our podcast, have downloaded a video, have interacted with us on social media with one of our videos. So we are impacting people, and we want to grow. We want to go from 100,000 to 250,000 by the end of this year, and that's a big lift, guys, but we can do it. And then we're going to go to 1 million Christians by the presidential election 2024. Again, not telling them how to vote. We're nonpartisan. We're Christian, but we're helping inform them and teach them how to engage with this space. Governor, let's talk about, we got some questions popping up, but before we answer any more questions, talk to us for a minute about how we interact as a Christian in politics, because you've got a lot of experience with that. How do you watch your heart and make sure that you're operating in the right spirit with love and boldness at the same time?
Well, the ultimate example is Christ, right? I mean, in the sense that you look all throughout the Gospels in particular, you see Jesus going to the places that nobody else would go to. In fact, he was mocked by the religious leaders at the time. You're eating with sinners out there. Well, we're all sinners.
Yes.
And so, and I think that's something that is really so important, because then you look and say, but he constantly was affirming what God had told the church prior to his coming in terms of the Old Testament, in terms of what God's will was. In fact, it's interesting. Think about this. You talk about praying. I reinforce that. So he's open to everybody. He's still firm on what God's law is, and in between that, what connects that. Even though he came from God, what does he do? He prays.
Yes.
Over and over again. Even when he knows he's right literally at the eve of his crucifixion, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and prays and lifts it up. So constantly, this is someone who knew. It's kind of like the wisdom of taking the seventh day of resting. God knows that we need to reconnect, that Christ knew it. We need to reconnect with, in his case, his Heavenly Father, for us the same. And so prayer is just such a critical part of that, praying for God's will, not only to be bold to do the things that are right, but in how to do it. I know for me, part of it was when we had all the attacks and the viciousness, it would have been completely legitimate to respond in kind. But there's so many great examples of turning the other cheek. Doesn't mean going mushy, doesn't mean backing away, doesn't mean failing to be bold, but it means not responding in kind. And I think that's one of the powerful messages, not just for people who are in office, but for particularly people advocating for candidates, for voting, for helping, for supporting others out there. A lot of us who are defined by the media and by others as being Christian immediately get portrayed, because of our stance on some issues, as being heartless, as not caring, as the opposite is true. And the best thing we can do is continuously showing them the compassion and love that we have for our fellow citizen.
Good. We got a lot of questions. So we've got one from some prayer leaders out there that, we've got a lot of people that are praying and fasting around the nation, calling national days of prayer, praying for Israel right now. But we're not seeing a lot of government leaders calling for prayer and fasting. Do they believe in prayer and fasting? I know we had Governor Rick Perry years ago here in Texas called a solemn assembly, and
He did a great
everybody
job,
mocked him down in Houston. But thousands of people showed up. Our friend Doug Springer led that. But how do we bridge the gap between people that believe in prayer and politicians?
Well, I think part of it's this personal touch. The more you can make those connections. I'm actually with Rick. Fortunately, our leader tomorrow got delayed on a flight, isn't able to do it. But every Friday at 8:00, Rick and I and a bunch of current and former governors get together for governors Bible study that we do. We have our National Day of Prayer. It was funny when I was the county executive. I would go to the governor's prayer breakfast, and they'd say, "We haven't seen the governor for years, but it's nice to see you here."
The county official.
For 8 years, I went as the governor, and then over the years, the current governor doesn't go. So it's one of those, we're reaching out, making that personal connection. I think people are surprised. You've had experience with this, I know. People that sometimes you don't always agree with, but saying, "I'm praying for you," and not just saying it for show, but literally telling them. One of the best things I got was not only examples like I gave of the guy at the factory, but people not only saying they're praying for me, but people who would come up to me and say, "What can we pray for you for?" And that would really touch me. I remember I told two people I'm close with in 2012, Paul Ryan grew up down the road from me. I knew him when he was picked to be the running mate. 4 years later, I told Mike Pence the same thing when he was picked to be the running mate. Said, "You're both going to go on the campaign trail." In both cases, they went, I think it was to Iowa the next day. I said, people are going to come up to you, and they're going to tell you they're praying for you. So there'll be other people that'll tell you good luck, wish you well, all sorts of things. They may or may not be telling the truth. I said, I firmly believe in my heart that nobody tells you they're praying for you if they don't believe it.
Yep.
I saw that vividly during the protests, the riots, and eventually the recall election. I said, reach out and touch them. They both looked at me funny kind of first. I said, I always thought I did this because I always thought back to the unclean woman. The woman had been unclean for 12 years, who ran to the courtyard, even though she was totally violating the law of the time. But she so believed that Christ could help her that she reached out and just touched the end of his cloak. What did he do? He stopped.
He recognized her.
Everything. He could feel it.
Yeah.
And he turned and said, "Who touched me?" Even though he knew. And she fell to the ground. And I remember so vividly, I'd read it for years, but hadn't read it till we had a visiting pastor. The pastor said, he reminded us that in that passage, it doesn't just say anything. He says, "My daughter." He claims her to all of them as his own and says, "Your faith has healed you." And it's, to me, just such a powerful moment, that touch. So what I told them was, go out, and when people tell you they're praying for you, I do this. I touch maybe the elbow, maybe their hand, and you can feel it. And it was funny. They both days later said, "Wow, you weren't kidding." I just think it's a powerful moment. So when people ask, how can you get people engaged, not just in calling for a statewide day of prayer, but for actively being involved, engaged in prayer, and not being afraid to talk about, not being afraid to do it.
Yes.
There's all sorts of pushback. The National Freedom from Religion Association is actually based in my capital city, Madison, Wisconsin. They will constantly fight you on this, but be bold, still do that. And some of the best ways to get our leaders, whether it's the president, the governor, the mayor, whomever, to do it is personally to make that a connection. Not in front of the crowd, not in front of the media. Personally reach out and find ways to tell them that you're praying for them, and ask what you can pray for them and their family for, and that will draw them in to want to help lead others to prayer.
That's so good. We've got one of our college students that supports us, wondering, he's in Arkansas, actually.
Oh, nice.
But he wants to know, when did you discover God's call to be in the political space? When was that moment where you're like, God's calling me to be in the political space?
That is a great question, particularly from a young person. So I had, as a kid, I mentioned going earlier today, I talked about going to Philadelphia a couple weeks ago, and I always love going there. Because I'm just fascinated with their founders. As a kid, I thought of the founders as, I may have been a geek because I thought of them like superheroes, bigger than life. And but I didn't get a chance on a pastor's salary. We never traveled very far, much further than we could drive, So I didn't get there until I was grown up as an adult. And I just was so blown away. But I loved history, loved civics, loved our founders, but always thought I'd go into business. And when I went my senior year of high school, the summer going into that, I had a chance. The American Legion has a program called Boys State. It's in all across the country. There's Girls State as well. I went to Boys Nation. I was one of the 2 young men picked for that. And I just felt this calling, this sense of it's not enough just to be interested in it. It didn't tell me when. I went back into college and actually worked in the private sector for a while. But when I was 25, there was an opening in the legislature, and I just felt called to go into it, and I did. But it wasn't some conventional path. I didn't work as a staffer. I didn't intern. I literally worked for the American Red Cross. And so it was just an unusual path, but it was following God's lead along the way. And I think that's really the key out there, is trying to figure out, what is God calling us to do? It might be when you're young. It might be when you're retired. It might be somewhere in between. God's got a place for those who are willing to follow the calling that he has.
And I love that only in America can you have someone that didn't have a political background, right? Came from a minister's family.
Yeah.
And
Didn't have any wealth.
Yeah, and didn't have any money, and run for governor and be successful.
Yeah.
And you're one of those amazing
The
stories.
The other funny thing on that, just one quick add-on, so you appreciate this. My dad's a pastor. I was fortunate enough growing up that coming back from a lot of these church events, I'd give a report, and after a while, my dad would say, well, I got to go to a conference. Why don't you fill in and preach for me? Well, I was okay at it. So some of the other pastors in town, when they were leaving, would say, hey, would you fill in a pulpit supply? So years later, when I ran for and was successfully elected to the legislature, some of the people in my dad's church said, how could your son do that? We all thought he was going to follow in your footsteps. How could he go into such an awful profession?
Mm.
And my father had this great answer. He looked at me and said, what kind of people do you want in government?
Oh, that's a good answer.
Right?
Yes.
He said, you want God-fearing people. You don't want, he said, so it goes to the heart of what you're doing. It said, if you want people who share your values, if you want people who are God-fearing, who seek God's will in office, they got to run.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody else isn't going to do it.
So, guys, if you haven't heard, I actually got a publishing deal with Charisma on their Frontline label. My book, Jesus in Politics, is coming out at our Wake Up Conference, which will be, for those of y'all who we haven't put it out yet, but it's November 3rd and 4th. Michelle Bachmann will be with us, Kelly Shackelford, Congressman Michael Cloud, and many others. But we're going to release the book there, and it's really just a story of my life walking in this space, and I really want people to be inspired that you can go out and make a difference. So speaking of that, we got one question about, and we got to make these quicker, Governor, because we got a lot of questions.
Oh, good.
Who's one of your personal heroes of the faith that you look up to? And it could be in the Bible, or it could be, in the world. I don't know. And why?
Well, I always loved Billy Graham. I just thought he was such an inspiration. I'd already accepted Christ, but one of the first big events, my dad was a small town preacher, but we got invited years ago to the old Milwaukee County Stadium. It's actually the first time I met Coach Tom Landry. Even though I'm a Packers fan, I always admired Landry and Roger Staubach because of their backgrounds. But Coach Landry came and spoke to an advanced session for that. But I was just so amazed with the power, not just to get big crowds, but just with the authority that Billy Graham preached with, and the compassion he had. He'd go anywhere in the world for that. And I was just so mesmerized by him as just such a great church leader. So the other day when I was in Philadelphia, I stopped by the Faith and Freedom Center. And as we went through the halls, there was an echoing of a videotape with one of his sermons on, and it just made me turn and look, because I just loved hearing Billy Graham.
That's awesome. Are you currently mentoring a person as the next governor of Wisconsin, or some leading person that we should be looking for in the future around the country?
Well, in Wisconsin, I'd worked for a long time. Our lieutenant governor is a great believer, Rebecca Clayfish. She made an attempt. Unfortunately, it didn't work for her this last time, but looking ahead, I think there are some great younger talent. I look at someone like a Mike Gallagher, used to work for me. He was my national security advisor. He's a Marine, served 2 tours in Iraq. It's just wicked smart. rock solid conservative, went to Princeton of all places, served in the Marine Corps. I mean, he's like the Renaissance man.
And he's in the House of Representatives.
He's from
right
Green
now.
Bay. Yeah, Green Bay, Wisconsin. He just was named the chairman of the House Select Committee on the CCP. So he's been warning, even when he worked for me for years, about the Chinese Communist Party and the Uyghurs and the challenges not only against religious minorities like Uyghurs, but against Christians and others out there. Finally, people are starting to take notice, but he got that on my radar years ago, and he's just a really smart guy. Whether some of us would love to see him take on Tammy Baldwin in the United States Senate, I don't know if he'll do that, but he'd equally be impressive as a gubernatorial candidate, and more importantly, as a governor in the future.
Well, as you can imagine, we're getting people wanting to know who you're going to endorse for president. So, but let's ask it this way. I'm sure, I don't know if you're going to endorse or not, or stay out of the primary, but is there a litmus test that you have? Is there issues that you're looking for as we look through these different presidential candidates in both parties?
Well, I can give you any sort of anecdotes or impressions on just about any of the candidates out there, because on the Republican side, most of them I served with in one capacity. They're with a few exceptions, they're all pretty good friends of mine, and so we're actually at Young America's Foundation a partner in the first presidential primary debate.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, in August in Milwaukee. So one that's pretty cool. We're going to incorporate questions from students at some of our conferences and events out there, making a focus on how do we make inroads with young people. We've also invited the candidates all to some of our conferences, the college conference at the end of July. So with that in mind, and it probably makes it easier for me being friends with all these folks, I'm neutral in the sense that until there's a nominee, I'm not, particularly with that primary or the debate involvement, not picking a candidate. But I think, to me, I want people who don't just say the right things, who I believe are going to act on them. I like to think for people I talked to who said, I supported you in the past, part of the support was I wasn't the biggest personality in the room, but people said, hey, he said what he was going to do and he went out and did it. And I want to know people not just tell me that, but what about them makes me confident that they're going to do that?
Yeah.
It's part of the reason why I was suspect at first, but I acknowledged that I was wrong in the sense that Donald Trump did the things that he said he was going to do, and the things that I wanted a president to do from a conservative, my point of view standpoint. The one concern I have about the president, probably not unlike a lot of people out there, is the tone. He exceeded my expectations on policy. He exceeded my expectations in the opposite direction in terms of the tone and tenor, right? I think he's at his best when he's like he was in West Palestine, Ohio a few months ago when there was the train wreck and he came and showed up and handed out cleaning supplies and brought bottled water and said, you're not alone. You're not forgotten. Even if Joe Biden's not here, I'm here. I said, that's the guy that won in 2016. That would be a great guy going forward as president. So whether it's him or DeSantis or Pence or Tim Scott or Nikki Haley or any of the others out there, I want to know from them what's their plan. Because even with the president, let alone a governor or other official, the past is not what we're voting on.
Right.
It gives you an indicator of whether or not you can check the record to say, did they make promises and follow through? So it's good to look at, but if elections are always about the future. So from President Trump and from all the other candidates, what I want to hear from is what's your plan and then how you're going to do it.
That's a good question for all of us to ask. So we got a question here on, is Young America is doing a Reagan biopic?
No, but we have a lot of people involved. So that's just a great question. So Mark Joseph, the guy who was the producer on The Passion of the Christ years ago, is the executive producer on a movie about Reagan. It is, we don't know exactly when it's come out. It's not something we're doing directly. Dennis Quaid is actually playing, who's from Texas, is playing Ronald Reagan. Penelope Ann Miller is playing Nancy Reagan. John Voight is in the movie. He's playing a KGB agent who kind of chronicles Reagan's life from early on into post-presidency. I've seen clips of it, or a chunk unedited, a completely unedited portion of it. Looks pretty exciting, particularly the part with the characters I mentioned. The reason why it's connected to us is they filmed the portions of his life at the Reagan Ranch. because that's something we do.
Well, and a lot of people don't know that Young America's Foundation owns the Reagan Ranch, right?
We took it over in 98, so 25 years ago. Mrs. Reagan, instead of selling it off, put everything back in it. So his hats, his boots, his riding gear, his saddles, all the things that were in that house are still there. We bring, in fact, if folks are interested, if you're listening, go, hey, I want my kids or my grandkids to go there, yaf.org. We have high school, college, and now middle school programs at the ranch and elsewhere around the country. We just had actually in Dallas a couple months ago a Freedom Conference. But the Reagan Ranch is just, we have a center. We bring in conservative speakers multiple days. There's minimal fee to it. We cover the food, the housing, all those sorts of costs. But then one of the days they always go up to the ranch. They tour the ranch. They tour the ranch house. They see the hay barn. They see the Secret Service Center. It's pretty cool. And for those of us who are fans, people often say you shouldn't go to the homes of your heroes or be disappointed. The opposite's true at the Reagan Ranch. Everything you loved about Ronald Reagan, you see tenfold.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to close this up. Thank you guys for being with us. I want to remind you, I want to first of all thank all of you that have got us here and support us. We have so many monthly donors that give $10, $25, $50, $100 a month that enables us to do this work. We have some projects we want to fund in the next coming weeks and months. We need to fund our biblical economics class. All of our curriculum costs us about $25,000 to do with all of the development, with all the filming, the editing. But these are quality classes. In June, we're releasing Biblical Justice. We recorded it at an old courthouse in Texas. And we've got David Barton and Stuart Greaves from IHOP Kansas City and Dr. Jeremiah Johnston from Prestonwood and Kirby Anderson and Scott Turner and so many people in the ministry world from across denominational lines on these curriculums. So some of you guys can give $1,000 or $5,000 to help us build these curriculum packages. Some of you guys, $25 a month is a huge lift. Just know we value all of you. We need all of you in our life. And so many of you that are volunteers and area leaders for us around the country, thank you for teaching people our curriculum, opening up your home, opening up your heart to help lead people into civic engagement and the Bible. And we just want to honor you. Thank you for walking with us. We love you so much. And just know that our victories are your victories. There's no way we could do this without you. No, we wouldn't even be here. A year and a half ago, when the IRS denied our tax exempt status and said that Bible teachings are typically affiliated with the Republican Party and candidates, we had $7,000 in the bank. And I, as most of you know, and I share in the book that's coming out in November, I was working for our U.S. member of Congress, Michael Cloud. And I had to call the congressman. I said, this is our moment. We either take this or we don't. And I quit my job and went out by faith. And my husband's looking on going, what in the world is happening here? Well, 3 weeks later, because of some people that stepped in to help, we had $80,000 in the bank. And we did $700,000 last year. And we want to go to $1.5 million this year. I know that sounds impossible, but I want to just encourage you, whether you watch this on our podcast or you're watching this right now, to help us. Help us with a monthly donation. Help us with an annual donation as large as you can and help us grow this ministry. ChristiansEngaged.org. Go to the donate page. Check out all of our programs there and donate tonight while you're thinking about it. Or up your monthly, go from 25 to 50. Just go out by faith, okay? We love you guys so much, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate you. Governor Walker, thank you so much. I cannot thank you for coming to Dallas for us and doing this. It's just been a gift.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and we'll keep praying for you and all the people you just talked about who are actively engaged across the country.
Yes. And a couple testimonies, guys. We had a young woman down in Victoria that went through our On-Ramp to Civic Engagement seminar 2 years ago, got involved with her local political party, took our Salt and Light, How to Impact Your Local Community curriculum, and then ran for school board in Victoria and won. Another young man's on the Texas School Board of Education because he was impacted by this ministry, and we're constantly encouraging him. We've had people run for Congress. We've had people run for state representative. We've had a young African-American woman in Arlington, Texas that ran for school board and lost, and she is now the legislative director for the Texas Homeschool Coalition now because of her obedience and coming to our wake-up conferences and then going through our curriculum. So I just want to encourage you guys to step out, do what God's called you to do, and I'll end with this. You know, Nehemiah, check out my Leadership of Nehemiah class, but Nehemiah had to go into a city that no one knew his name, and he mobilized and gathered the people of God to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days. This was before cell phones and text messages and emails. He walked in a city with the favor and blessings of the Lord and taught people how to rebuild the walls of defenses of their nation quickly. How in the world did he do that? I'll tell you how he didn't do it. He didn't have people wringing their hands on how deep the problem was or looking at the breadth of the wall and how large it was and all the broken down places and all the enemies, Sanballat and Tobiah and all of them that were gathered around just wanting to mock them. He said, and put each household family member, each mother and father on the wall and said, this is your section. This is your place. And one brick at a time, they rebuild the defenses of their nation. One brick at a time. And I really believe that's a word for us all today. Don't just get discouraged by what's happening. Hope is alive, and God is moving. He's moving in the lives of young people, and he's moving in our nation. And one Christian and one heart at a time, we can impact the world with prayer, voting, and engagement. Love you guys, and we will see you on the weekly podcast and everything else we're doing with Christians Engage. We love you so much. Thank you, Governor Walker. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible podcast. What a time we've had. We love you so much. We love being in your life. Have you subscribed? Have you shared this with your family and friends? Please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, wherever you get your audio or video pods. We need your help. This mission is undergirded by individuals just like you that support this ministry monthly, annually, and whenever you think about us, to be able to reach over 1 million Christians in the next 2 years. That's our goal. We want to empower 1 million Christians around America to pray, vote, and engage regularly. Will you help us? We're here to do that, and we need your help. I want to say thank you to our partners at The Stream. What an incredible online publication put out by James Robinson and Life Outreach International, as we come together across denominational lines as believers to discern what God's saying about the news of the day and to hear from different viewpoints. Check out The Stream, make it your homepage, and get on their email list. This product is amazing. Also, our partners at Edify app, put out by Christian Post. This podcast app is a convergence of Bible teachers around America. We're excited to be a part of Edify app. Check out all their other podcasts. Thank you so much again for caring about this nation. We're here to help you pray, vote, and engage. We'll see you next week.